On the morning of September 7, 2008, a man named Thomas Reed called police from a payphone outside a gas station on the outskirts of Dalton County. Dalton County was not the kind of place people chose. It was the kind of place that chose you, and then refused to let go. Abandoned factories lined the main road like gray tombstones. Streets cracked and unrepaired. A town that had been dying slowly since 1984 and had never quite finished the job. Thomas said his wife had gone for a walk the previous night and never returned. His voice was flat. No tears, no trembling, just steady, careful words delivered in the right order. Dispatcher Ruth Daniels had taken emergency calls for 11 years. She had heard grief in every form it comes in, raw, desperate, broken. What she heard from Thomas Reed was none of those things. She dispatched 2 officers and filed the report, but she thought about that voice for a very long time afterward. Catherine Reed was 29 years old and had spent her entire life preparing for a world that turned out to be nothing like she expected. She had grown up in Portland, Oregon, studied psychology, worked as a counselor helping teenagers who had no one else to talk to. Her colleagues called her the kind of person who made you feel like you mattered without ever trying to. She had met Thomas Reed at a conference in Seattle in the spring of 2005. He was charming, attentive. He listened completely, the rare kind of listening that makes you feel like the only person in the room. They married in June 2006. When Thomas inherited the house in Dalton County, Catherine had reservations, but Thomas was persuasive. "A fresh start," he said. "Just us." Her best friend, Dana Marsh, called every week for the first 3 months after the move. Then Catherine stopped answering. The last thing she ever said to Dana was, "I think I made a mistake." Then the line went dead. Detective Ray Carver had been on the force for 26 years and had learned one thing above everything else. The guilty don't always look guilty. Sometimes they look like the most reasonable man in the room. Carver was 52, thick hands, quiet eyes, the kind of detective who said very little and noticed everything. He drove to the Reed property on a Tuesday morning. The road leading to it was unpaved, surrounded on both sides by dead trees that cast no shadow because they had no leaves. The house was large and gray, every curtain drawn, every window dark. Even in the morning light, it felt like evening. Thomas Reed opened the door before Carver knocked. He was calm, polite. He offered coffee. He answered every question clearly and looked Carver directly in the eye the entire time. On the drive back, Carver pulled over on the empty road and sat for a moment. In the entire house, there was not a single photograph of Catherine Reed. Not one. Thomas Reed's record was clean, completely, almost perfectly clean. No arrests, no complaints, no red flags of any kind in any database Carver could access. He made calls anyway. Catherine's mother in Portland hadn't heard from her daughter in 4 months. She had assumed Catherine was busy, settling in, finding her rhythm. Catherine's former co-workers described her as warm, present, deeply engaged with her work. Not one of them had heard from her since the move to Dalton County. Then Carver pulled the county financial records. He found it on a Tuesday afternoon, alone in his office, with a cold cup of coffee and the kind of silence that means something. 6 months before Catherine disappeared, Thomas Reed had taken out a life insurance policy on his wife. $1 million. Sole beneficiary, Thomas Reed. Carver sat very still for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called the district attorney. The search warrant was approved Thursday afternoon. 6 officers arrived at the Reed property at dawn the following morning. The sky was the color of ash. The dead trees stood perfectly still in the cold air, like they were waiting. Thomas Reed stood on the porch and watched them arrive. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He stood with his arms at his sides and watched with the same flat expression Carver had seen on the first day. The search took 9 hours. They found Catherine's passport in a kitchen drawer, her wallet, her phone, her keys. Everything she would have needed to go anywhere voluntarily was still inside that house, but Catherine was not. At the edge of the property, where the dead trees gave way to open ground, a young officer stopped walking and called out. The earth at the tree line had been disturbed. recently, carefully, as if someone had worked very hard to make it look natural. Thomas Reed, watching from the porch, didn't react at all. Forensic teams worked through the night. The disturbed earth was 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. It had been dug up and carefully refilled sometime in the past 2 weeks, but it was empty. Whatever had been placed there had been removed. Carver stood at the edge of that ground as the sun came up over Dalton County and felt something settle in his chest like cold stone. Thomas Reed had known they were coming. He had moved her. Carver walked back to the house and found Thomas still on the porch, still watching, still completely still. Carver looked at him for a long moment. Thomas looked back. Neither man spoke. But in that silence, Carver understood something that he would later describe to his partner in a single sentence. That man has done this before, and he believes he is going to do it again. Carver pulled Thomas Reed's phone records going back 18 months. What he found was not random. It was a pattern, the kind that only becomes visible when you know what you are looking for. Every Thursday night between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., Thomas Reed's phone pinged a single cell tower 14 miles east of Dalton County, in the middle of an abandoned industrial zone that had been closed since 1994. No registered buildings, no roads on current maps, on satellite images, just empty land and the dark shapes of structures that no longer appeared in any official record. Carver drove out there on a Friday evening alone. The light was going. The road disappeared into gravel, then into dirt, then into nothing. He almost missed it. Behind a collapsed chain-link fence, completely hidden by years of dead growth, a structure, small, concrete, set into the ground, a door with a heavy lock that had been used recently. Carver put his hand on it and stood very still. Then he called for backup. He waited 40 minutes for 2 officers to arrive. 40 minutes alone in an abandoned industrial zone as the last light left the sky and the darkness around him became complete. He didn't use his flashlight. He stood in the dark and listened and thought about Catherine Reed and the life insurance policy and the empty grave at the tree line and the flat voice on the phone that had started all of this. When backup arrived, they opened the door together. The smell reached them before anything else. Then the stairs. Going down. At the bottom was a single room. Concrete walls, concrete floor, a chair, a table, a lantern. And on the table, a notebook. Carver picked it up with gloved hands and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was careful and precise, and belonged to Catherine Reed. She had been here. She had been alive. She had written everything down. Because Catherine Reed had always known that writing things down was the only power she had left. The notebook contained 47 entries. In the first entry, Catherine described the night Thomas brought her here. The drive through the dark, the door closing behind her, the sound of the lock. She described Thomas visiting every few days, bringing food, saying almost nothing. Looking at her the way you look at a problem you haven't solved yet. She described counting days by the faint sound of birds she could barely hear through the concrete. She described deciding, on day 31, that she was not going to wait to be found. She was going to find herself. She had noticed a loose block in the eastern wall on day 40. She worked at it every night for 6 days with her bare hands. The last entry read, "Tonight I get out. I have been in this room for 47 days and I know exactly who put me here and exactly what he planned. I have written all of it down, every detail, every date, every word he said. If you are reading this, use it." Catherine Reed was found alive at a truck stop 60 miles from Dalton County at 5:47 a.m. on the same morning Detective Carver discovered the underground room. She had walked through the entire night, barefoot, through dead fields and empty roads and the kind of darkness that has no bottom. She had been held underground for 47 days. Thomas Reed was arrested that afternoon at the house at the end of the dirt road. He was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee when officers arrived. He looked up at Carver when he walked in. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look afraid. He looked, Carver would say later, like a man who had simply run out of moves and had decided some time ago to be quiet about it. Thomas Reed was convicted of unlawful imprisonment and attempted murder in March 2010, sentenced to 35 years. Catherine moved back to Portland, changed her name. Started over, she still has the notebook. She says writing saved her life. Not the door, not the escape, the writing. Because as long as she was writing, she was still here. And as long as she was still here, Thomas Reed had already lost.